Today we're looking at Spanish America, the colonization of South and Central America. Our objectives are to identify key figures in the Spanish conquest of the Americas, examine Spanish colonial society, and analyze institutions and processes of Spanish imperialism. To begin, we have to start in Spain itself. In 711 AD, the Iberian Peninsula was conquered by the invading Islamic armies out of the Middle East. From 711 till 1492, Spanish forces continuously fought against the Islamic empires of the Umayyads and later the Abbasids in an attempt to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula for the Spaniards, the Portuguese, as well as for the Catholic Church. This period in Spanish history was known as the Reconquista, and it left its mark on Spanish society during the early modern era, as well as throughout the Americas wherever Spanish society extended. Two of the key figures were Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage united the major kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula into the Empire or the Kingdom of Spain, which later, through marriages to the Habsburg dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire, extended Spanish influence throughout Europe. In addition to this, the Reconquista left a legacy of a warlike spirit amongst many of its leading military figures. These individuals were known as conquistadors. They had been baptized in the fighting against Islamic forces in the name of the crown, as well as in the name of the Catholic Church. This martial spirit would continue with them as they led armies of explorers and conquerors into the Western Hemisphere. At the same time that they were politically unifying the Iberian Peninsula, they were also trying to unify it religiously. Previously, Jews and Muslims within Spanish kingdoms had experienced a degree of protection. However, as Spain became more and more powerful and the power of the remaining Islamic empires waned, Jews and Muslims experienced discrimination within Spanish borders. Then going into the 13 and 1400s, they experienced outright persecution through the Spanish Inquisition as the Spanish crown attempted to weed out any non-Christian communities within their borders. The final step of reconquest was the fall of the Kingdom of Granada. This was the last Islamic kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, and its collapse on the eve of Christopher Columbus's first expedition would leave Spain a truly unified area. Now, the major figure in Spanish expansion was Christopher Columbus. He arrived in the Kingdom of Spain and quickly gained the trust and the patronage of Isabella and Ferdinand. They were the ones that funded his 1492 expedition that attempted to reach India, China, and Japan, or what they called the Orient. As the story goes, however, he did not encounter the Orient. After all, he had grossly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, and instead he ran into the Americas. His first contact was Hispaniola, which is the modern-day Dominican Republic in Haiti, and there he established a small outpost, returning in 1494 with his second expedition that established the very first major colonial presence of the Spaniards in the region. Columbus himself was named the viceroy. However, as much as he was a great explorer, he did not necessarily have the touch to be a community leader. In other words, he proved much less competent as a governor. Now, in 1498 to 1500, he returned with yet another expedition and another cargo of settlers and supplies. This time, he was arrested, charged by the colonists of gross negligence on his part as viceroy, and shipped back to the crown, where he was later released. His final expedition from 1502 to 1504 would once again seek a passage to India, but would never be found. Columbus himself would die penniless only 2 years after his return to Spain. Columbus, however, established a foothold in the Caribbean, and it was from the Caribbean that the Spaniards would launch out into the continental Americas. Now, the first major figure to do so was an individual named Hernan Cortez, a conquistador and a capable leader. He set sail in 1519 with 11 ships, 530 soldiers, cavalry, as well as large mastiffs that they would use as war dogs against the Native American population. After arriving in Central America, he burned his ships so that way there would be no question of turning the expedition around, and began to march inland looking for gold, God, and glory. One of the first problems that he had, of course, was speaking to Native American communities in their language, as the Spaniards had no knowledge of it. However, he was fortunate. He met a shipwrecked sailor by the name of Geronimo de Aguilar, an individual who spoke Mayan and Spanish. Later, at the village of Tabasco, he was given a woman by the name of La Malinche, who also went down in history as Doña Marina, and she spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, a language that the Aztecs spoke. Now, the old story is that Cortez arrived in what is modern America with only 600 soldiers, superior weapons, and better tactics, and as a result managed to conquer an empire that rivaled anything in Europe in terms of size, in terms of knowledge, but not necessarily steel technology. The reality is far from it. One of the things that Cortez quickly realized was that he needed allies. One of the powerful kingdoms that he found in the region was that of Tlaxcala. As he would move inward, he would basically encounter different villages and give them an option. The option was that they could join forces with him and recognize Spain as the sovereign power in the region, or they would face death. This was known as the requerimiento. Basically, within European legal code, as well as within Christian tradition, Christian nations could only wage just wars against other peoples. By rejecting Christianity, this gave the Spaniards, at least in their eyes, the legal foundation for a war of conquest. Those forces that would join his side would quickly become his allies, both during the conquest of the Aztec as well as afterwards. Those that didn't, such as the village of Cholula, found themselves facing not only Cortez's soldiers, as well as his cavalry and these rather large dogs that they would sick on both fighting individuals, civilians, as well as the wounded, but also large armies of his Native American allies. Eventually, Cortez arrived at Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec. On November 19, 1519, he met their leader, Moctezuma. Now, you may also hear this or see this word spelled with an N, or this name spelled with an N and pronounced as Montezuma. Either, however, are acceptable when referring to the empire, since there is some disagreement in the transliteration of his name. Now, Moctezuma had long since been troubled. Many of the omens portended the coming of a great period of change when the god Quetzalcoatl would return to the Aztec people. As the Spanish armies marched inland, Moctezuma initially feared that perhaps this was the god Quetzalcoatl. Now, early histories of Cortez's expeditions simply left Moctezuma as this believer in Spanish divinity, and that this allowed them to be conquered. We do recognize today that while Moctezuma was uncertain in his initial contact with Cortez, he quickly realized that this was just a human being. Now, Moctezuma, seeing these new weapons and seeing these horses, as well as these foreign people, initially engaged in negotiations with Cortez. At the time, the Spaniards were an unknown factor within the borders of his empire, and it was pretty common practice among Native American peoples to try to see what Europeans wanted, if there was a possibility of trade, as well as a possibility of alliance against their other enemies. Unfortunately for the Aztec, they quickly realized that the Spaniards were there not for negotiations and an alliance, nor for trade, but instead for conquest. As Cortez himself once explained to Moctezuma, the Spaniards suffered from a sickness that only gold could cure. Shortly after arriving in the city, one of the first things that Cortez did is he moved his soldiers into place. He had his soldiers quartered in the capital, and when he himself marched off to deal with some former allies that had rebelled against him, his governor Velasquez arrested Cortez. Now, when Cortez returned, he found the city in an absolute uproar. The Spaniards had actually killed Moctezuma, although they blamed the Aztecs. And shortly afterwards, the entire city turned on the Spaniards in what was called La Noche Triste, in which the Spaniards in June of 1520 were absolutely ejected from the city, experiencing a number of casualties. In May, however, of 1521, they returned. Now, initially, again, in early histories, this was portrayed as a great battle in which Spanish horses, as Spanish steel weapons, quickly overwhelmed the Aztec warriors. However, the discovery of Aztec writings, as well as the writings from clergymen who were on the expedition, proved that the greatest ally that Cortez ended up having was not his steel weapons, nor his horses, nor his large mastiffs. It was, in fact, his microscopic allies, smallpox. The Spaniards had carried with them this disease into a city and into a region that had not yet been exposed to this very lethal disease. On the night that the Spaniards with their allies attacked Tenochtitlan, much of the city was laying sick, dying and suffering horribly from the smallpox disease. After the collapse of Tenochtitlan, Cortez would then turn his attention to pulling down many of the temples, destroying statues, collecting gold, burning many of the records that they viewed as heretical and quote-unquote pagan, and turning Tenochtitlan into the heart and the headquarters of the new Spanish territory. Further south, in 1532, another conquistador with dreams of glory and conquest in the name of the king and of the cross, an individual named Francisco Pizarro, set off on a similar expedition, this time to defeat the Incan Empire. Francisco Pizarro benefited from many of the same alliances benefited by making many similar alliances to what Cortez made in modern New Mexico. He also benefited from the advantage the bit of advantage that his weapons and his other war techniques gave him, and definitely benefited from the immunity that Spaniards already, or not the immunity, but from the antibodies that many Spaniards already had against the diseases that would ravage their enemies. Like Cortez, he entered the capital of the Incan Empire. In Atahualpa, the emperor initially welcomed him, only later to discover that the Spaniards were there not again for negotiations nor trade, but for conquest. Atahualpa himself quickly fell to the Spanish forces, and his brother Huáscar attempted to keep up a rebellion, a resistance against the Spanish forces, and he himself was later defeated in battle. Finally, after conquering the Incans, Conquistador Pizarro established a headquarters at Lima, and like Tenochtitlan, it would become the capital of the new Spanish territories in that region. Now, in terms of colonial society that emerged from these conquests, it very much resembled the hierarchical government that existed in the Kingdom of Spain. Keep in mind that going into the 1500s, this was a time in which two different political traditions were emerging. There was the form of constitutional government that the Netherlands and England existed under, in which a king's power was checked by a body usually of nobles, sometimes of elected officials, and in the case of England, this would be Parliament. On the other hand, you had absolute monarchies in which the king himself continued to hold absolute power, choosing instead to rule through a bureaucracy and through his nobles. Spain was one of the governments that was following the model of absolute monarchy. So in colonial Spain, they reorganized these territories into two viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru. At the top of the government was a viceroy who spoke in the name of the king. They were advised by what was called the Audiencia, a group of individuals that helped to craft laws and craft policy. It served as a council of sorts. In addition to that, the archbishop that was dispatched there by the church, but approved by the Spanish crown first, governed all church affairs. In essence, the Spanish crown would pave the way for conquest in establishing a new society, but the church would work hand in hand. Now, in order to guarantee the loyalty of their viceroys and to make sure that colonial society was developing along the ways that the king desired, the occasional visita or inspection would go through and make sure that all laws and all orders by the viceroy were in compliance. Now, at the local level, cities were governed by cabildos. These are town councils, and usually they would have a mayor, individuals who bore the title of corregidor or alcalde. Towns themselves were built along the model of what you would find in Spain, with Spanish architecture, a gridiron design, a main public square, as well as a place for market, government buildings, houses that displayed the wealth that Spanish colonists were gaining from trade in the Atlantic system, as well as government buildings. Now, society was divided largely on birth and this new concept that was developing known as race. As Europeans extended outward, as they encountered more closely societies in both sub-Saharan Africa as well as the Americas, they began to develop this belief system that ability was defined by physical characteristics. Today, it is recognized in society that this is not the case. Physical characteristics do not have anything to do with intelligence or capability, but at this time, that was the belief. As such, colonial society was divided into the casta system. At the very top, you had individuals that were known as peninsulares. These were people that came directly from Spain, and having been born in Spain, they were considered to be superior. They were considered to be, quote unquote, racially more pure. Now, below the peninsulares, you had Creoles. Creoles were Spaniards of Spanish ancestry, but because they were born in the colonies, they were considered second class to those individuals that were born, raised, and educated on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, after that, there was a whole array of different groupings of individuals based on ancestry. So if you look at the class of mestizos, for example, these were people that had one parent who was Spaniard, one parent that was Native American. And this went on even further and further with, mulattoes, for example, that had African ancestry, Quiotes, which were combinations of African and Native ancestors, as well as what was called the Indios, or people of pure Native American ancestry. And this type of grouping, this type of looking at the world through a racial view, would define much of Latin American societies throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s. And you could argue even into the 1900s, when finally movements began in places like Mexico of that embraced ancestry of all backgrounds. So in the case of Mexico, this would be La Raza movement in the 1900s. Now, to compensate the conquistadors, initially the viceroys were permitted to grant what were called encomiendas to their soldiers. An encomienda was a grant of land on which the conquistador or the encomendero was allowed to exact tribute from a local village. I'm sorry, not encomendero. The encomienda was the land, and adelantado was the title that was granted that included these rights. Now, initially, the owner of the encomienda was supposed to guarantee the well-being and the spiritual education of the Native Americans, but what usually ended up happening was that the Native American villages were used for slave labor. As a result of the disruption of their society, the introduction of new diseases, loss of control over their own lives, as well as this enslavement, the lifespans of Native Americans tended to be cut very short, especially if they were forced into service at a local silver or gold mine. This treatment of Native Americans eventually reached back to the king largely through the protest of priests like Bartolomé de las Casas. He was an individual who initially was an encomendero, an owner of encomienda. He later became a Dominican priest, and through tracts like The Destruction of the Indies, written in 1552, he raised to the attention of the church in Europe, as well as the crown, that the Spanish settlers were not living up to the expectations of them of treating the Native Americans in a Christian manner, much less looking after their physical or spiritual well-being. As a result of these protests, as well as the passage of reforms known as the New Laws of 1542 to 1543, the practice of granting encomiendas stopped, and instead, colonists could only receive what were known as haciendas. And these are basically just land grants. If they wanted labor from local Native American villages, they would have to pay or barter for it. Although, keep in mind, slavery still existed, and Native Americans, as well as Africans, both could be enslaved. After this, the main thrust of colonization and transforming Native American villages into Spanish colonial settlements came or was given to the church. And what developed was what we know as the Mission Presidio system. So the Presidio was basically a fortress. This is where the Spanish troops would bivouac, where they would live and where they would train. And as you can see here, they had walled enclosures. They had a local church. They had everything they needed to maintain their or to meet their needs. The presidios were located in proximity to the missions, but not close to it. What the church wanted to do is they wanted to keep the soldiers, who were viewed as a bad influence on the local Native Americans, away from the Native American converts. Now, in the mission, as you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, there was an entire village established within the walls. These walls were twofold. Number one, they were used to protect the inhabitants. And number two, they were also used to keep the inhabitants within the boundaries of the mission and to keep them from running away and trying to go back to their traditional lifestyles. In addition to the walls, you had a church, as well as uh, barracks or cloisters for the monks and the nuns. The villagers themselves had their homes usually located on the perimeter as well as the interior. And there were usually workshops and storage areas where any necessary implements could be produced, with all of the farms, the irrigated lands on the outside, as well as the livestock. And so the missions themselves became the village. And missions were crucial to Spanish colonization. If one were to travel to modern day San Antonio, he or she could still go on what's called the mission walk or the mission trail. Basically, San Antonio initially was not settled by Spanish colonists. In fact, the Crown found it almost impossible to locate settlers that far away from New Spain, from the capital. Local tribes such as the Comanche and the Kiowa, as well as the Apache, proved to be too formidable for the local presidio to defend many of the settlements. And as such, the only institutions that really found any foothold in this area were the missions. So early San Antonio, prior to attempts to colonize it by the Spaniards, really in the late 1700s and early 1800s, really was just a collection of different missions with a presidio that defended them. Now, modern-day Mexico, what they called New Spain there, as well as Peru, were the main outposts of settlement, the two primary viceroys. And from there, the Spanish could launch other what were called entradas, or expeditions to discover the lands around them or to explore the lands around them. So one of the earliest entradas into northern America was led by Panfilo de Narvaez, 1528, which was an attempt to explore Florida and the southeast. Now, in this expedition, Narvaez himself was killed, but as well as almost all of his men. However, Cabeza de Vaca and two other Spaniards did survive. Unable to reach Hispaniola or to travel down to Central America by boat, these men crossed overland through the Southwest and down Texas, along the way finding refuge amongst Native American villages by acting as a sort of healer. And it was their expedition that brought information back to the Spaniards, informing them about the Native American tribes in that region. The next major entrada was led by Hernando de Soto from 1539 to 1543, in which he attempted to retrace Cabeza de Vaca and Panfilo de Narvaez's steps. Now, Hernando de Soto, as he went along, was also attempting to conquer. And so much of Native American memory of De Soto and his expedition was basically of pillage and plunder and destruction. Hernando de Soto and his forces were eventually surrounded, outnumbered by local Native Americans that decided they had enough. They suffered from disease, from exhaustion, low morale, as well as hunger, and were forced to eventually retreat on makeshift boats. Now, another major figure was that of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who from 1540 to 1542 explored not only the modern-day Southwest, but also deep into the Great Plains, reaching modern-day Kansas. Initially, he was seeking gold. He was told by a Native American by the name of Esteban that the 7 cities of Cibola lay north from New Spain. And Coronado followed this would-be guide deep into the heart of what is modern America until he later discovered that his guide had been lying to him, and he killed him. While Coronado never found the 7 cities of Cibola, He did at least discover the Grand Canyon as well as the Great Plains, and we believe he is one of the first Spaniards to set eyes on the bison. Now, in the eastern regions, the Spanish would continue to explore and to attempt to colonize the region. They did establish some colonies in Florida, mainly with Fort Caroline and St. Augustine in 1565, but their Floridian attempts never prospered. Another area where they focused, aside from Texas and Florida, was that of New Mexico. In 1550, Juan de Oñate led an expedition of settlers north, following the Red River deep into modern-day New Mexico, and there established a string of settlements. Through conquest and negotiation, he eventually brought the Puebloan peoples under the rule of the Spanish Empire. However, 50 years after his death, there was a revolt by the Puebloan peoples led by a Native American leader known as Pope. Pope and his troops managed to eject the Spanish settlers and the Spanish troops out of the region. They then set about to destroying any vestiges of Spanish rule as well as Christian religion. We also credit the Pueblo Revolt with the rapid spread of horses throughout the Great Plains in the Southwest. As Spanish garrisons were overcome, herds were seized by the Pueblo people who had learned to train them and to ride them from their Spanish conquerors. And they traded these animals as well as their knowledge to tribes such as the Comanche, who would then reform or evolve their cultures around this animal. Now, far in the west, there was also another major figure in the settlements for the Spanish crown. In modern-day California, Spanish missionaries had already penetrated deep into the region and begun their efforts at converting Native American villages. But it wasn't until Juan Bautista de Anza successfully led the first major party of settlers who arrived in modern California on January 4th, 1776. And from there would begin the process of establishing what would later become one of the most prosperous and valuable of Spain's colonies in the Americas. So Spain, New Spain, it was an ambitious event. They were among the very first of the Europeans to truly start to colonize this region. They themselves would establish some of the first Spanish libraries and universities. Their culture was considered to be one of the most advanced. Their military, some of the most powerful in this region of the world, until the United States of America would begin to rival them in the North America in the 1800s. Initially, conquest, striking down their enemies who denied their offer to show allegiance or to vow allegiance and to convert, was the main thrust of their imperial achievements. However, they would eventually develop a colonial society that attempted to integrate Native Americans into the daily life of the settlers. And this was largely done by connecting with them and using the church to proselytize, to teach them European knowledge, and to attempt to replace indigenous culture with Spanish society. As one of the most powerful empires in the Americas, Spain not only became incredibly wealthy from the export of raw goods and valuable minerals and metals to Spain from the colonies, but they would inevitably leave their mark on the Americas from that point forward.